I'm working with the JRC in Ispra in Italy, and we're helping in the Innovation Fund with regards to the greenhouse gas methodology for energy intensive industries. So we're going to talk a little bit about this now, and we're going to give a couple of examples. And one of the things that can be seen is that this can get pretty complicated very quickly. But for today, we've got a couple of simple examples. And I'd just like to reiterate that the examples are just that. They're not defining any preference for the type of project we wish to see. So these are just examples. And we're expecting and we are getting input from many different types of industries, which is exactly what we wanted. So basically, you can see the overall schematic here of when you're looking at your greenhouse gas intensity or the savings that you're going to expect from your project, your Innovation Fund project. You can see the three main boxes there: project, reference, and change. And essentially what we're talking about is the difference between what happens. You begin with your project, so you have an innovative project for producing a fuel or making a product, and you compare that to the reference. And the difference between the two is your change. It's going to give you that delta is going to give you the greenhouse gas savings or the benefit to your project. So what you're saying in effect is, if you replace the reference with your project, this is the benefit that we're getting at. And Maria's already talked about the greenhouse gas savings, the relative and the absolute. And the reason why we have this, we compare the two systems, is that for a lot of projects, not all, you will find that the many of these the parts of the system will stay the same. So when I say parts of the system, I mean in the project and reference box, which you see in front of you, you have inputs, processes, products, use, and end of life. And those are the 5 big blocks that we're considering. So you might find in your project that you're only changing one of those 5 boxes. So for instance, maybe your process is slightly different, or your process changes. Maybe the product that you're making is a different product, but it can replace an existing product. So on the left of the screen there on the slide, you can say produce the processes are those that produce the principal products, and these are under the control of the applicant. They use the EU ETS calculation rules, so we'll get onto that in a little bit, and there are specifics why we're doing that. But basically, the good news is that emissions can be ignored if they don't change in any of these boxes. So some of the questions we've been seeing have been from project applicants who are quite worried about the level of detail they have to go to, or the amount of inputs or greenhouse gas intensities that they'll have to find. When in fact, the good news is that if when they're comparing their project to the reference, if there isn't a change, then those inputs or processes, they can be ignored. In fact, any of those within the 5 boxes, any of which do not change, can be ignored. So hopefully that's clear. That's actually quite a big point. Next slide, please. So exactly what I was touching on there. So the greenhouse gas emissions that would occur in the absence of the project are calculated and based on the assumption that in the reference scenario, the product would be delivered under the following circumstances. So for the moment, or for the focus of my speech, is on energy intensive industry. The reference scenario is the EU ETS benchmark or benchmarks for the product. For biofuels, we have fossil fuel comparators, and that's you've probably already seen in table 2.1 in the annex. And I should say we've had a lot of questions on that annex for fuels that maybe aren't covered in the existing table, so we've updated that. Renewable electricity, we discussed the expected 2030 electricity mix. That's your reference scenario. For new renewable heat, we compare it to a natural gas boiler, and for energy storage, we discuss a single cycle natural gas turbine. Next slide, please. So energy intensive industries, reference scenario. So where possible, the reference scenario for new processes would use EU ETS benchmarks, and that's a pretty well established principle. The reference for modifying existing plant may be the existing plant, provided the EU ETS benchmarks are met overall. So you can use the existing plant if as a reference if you're modifying it, but you have to still respect the EU ETS benchmarks. Fuel products, if you're making fuel, these are judged against the fossil fuel comparators, and as I said, we've expanded that table, which I think we get to later on in the talk. So there are simplifications, because we realize this can be quite a detailed bit of work to undertake for anybody. So we do have simplifications, and right now we're looking at the first stage. So inputs with joint emissions which are less than 10% of the total emissions ascribed to the inputs may be neglected. Inputs with joint emissions less than 30%, you can take the emissions from literature. For other inputs, we look at actual emissions calculations if possible. If there's a difficulty, you can notify us of that and give a justification. But these are the rules that we've set out. For the second stage, it's a similar approach with slightly different percentages. And next slide, please. So now we're getting to the heart, I suppose, of what we wanted to discuss today in this presentation are the calculation examples. So the next slide. And again, I just want to reiterate, we've started here with a green hydrogen example, but I mean, we know there's a huge input from chemical industries, from steel industry, from many different industries. So this is purely it's intended to show the important aspects of how the methodology works in practice, and it's really for illustrative purposes. And as I said, we are expecting projects from many industries and sectors, but for the purposes of the example, this is a relatively simple starting point, and it's important that we start from there and starting from something more complex. So going through the slide, at the third point, we're considering a project to produce green hydrogen. It falls within the energy intensive industry. Hydrogen is the only, and it's therefore the principal product. The sector is hydrogen, and there was a slide earlier from Maria which showed the different sectors, but this is definitely the hydrogen sector, and we're assuming that the hydrogen is supplied for industrial use. And for people that want to really dig into this, there's a link to where the data for this example broadly came from. Next slide, please. So the greenhouse gas avoidance schematic. So we've already seen an introduction to this earlier. We're talking about the project, which is the green hydrogen, the reference, which is the existing, the EU ETS benchmark, and comparing the two will give us the change. So next slide, please. So the first step is identifying your processes and inputs. So on the left of the slide, you can see the project here, and within that, the process really is the electrolysis process. So inputs, you could have power if it's not part of the process, water or heat for high temperature, water and heat, sorry, I should say, for high temperature electrolysis. So power generation, renewable power production could be placed within the project boundary as a process, or outside the boundary as an input. So you'll see that there right in front of you. The power generation, you could treat it as an input, or it could be part of your electrolysis process. At the bottom of that slide, text is a little bit small, but it's saying that the emission factor for electricity consumed is zero either way, assumed 2050 grid electricity greenhouse gas intensity. Basically, we're assuming that in 2050 the grid is going to be completely clean from a greenhouse gas intensity point of view. So that's the project. So we've got our electrolysis, we're making green hydrogen. Now the reference is, you look at the processes and the inputs again, and the EU ETS benchmark for hydrogen. So the inputs, here we've written none, but basically all the relevant process elements directly or indirectly linked to the production of hydrogen and the separation of hydrogen and carbon monoxide are included in the benchmark. So essentially the inputs required are within the EU ETS benchmark. So next slide, please. Focus on heat. So you saw that one of the inputs in the project scenario was heat, and heat is needed for high temperature electrolysis. And there are options that you could consider within this. And again, this is just an example. If the heat is generated by direct fossil fuel combustion, you include those combustion emissions as part of the electrolysis process. So in that case, if you're including those emissions within the process, you simply don't have heat as an input. Now, if heat is supplied from outside the project unit, you have to look at the source and assess it as an input. So hopefully that's clear. So we've moved out of the process, and it's now an input. So heat, if it's a byproduct from other process, you treat it as a rigid input. So in other words, if you're taking that heat from another use and you're taking it and putting it into your innovative project, you need to identify any emissions which could arise due to that diversion. So if you've taken heat from somebody else, you have to look at, well, how is that somebody else going to replace the heat that they need? Otherwise, you treat heat as an elastic input. So you assess the actual greenhouse gas emissions of heat generation. So in other words, if you're simply saying, well, you can make more of that, you don't actually have to divert it from an existing use, you can simply just make more of it, then you need to assess the actual greenhouse gas emissions of heat generation. Next slide, please. So this is an overview of the process boxes. You've 5 installations, 2 products, a number of inputs. Yeah, it's a pretty self-explanatory schematic. You've some CO2 emissions from various installations. You know, it's a very, very good idea. I know this may look extremely basic, but it's a very, very good idea to have this type of an approach before you get into massive detail, because without clarity at this level, you're going to get stuck very, very quickly. So if we can move on to the next slide, please. So essentially what we're talking about here is we have our project, we have a reference, and now we're going to start beginning to look at the change. So on the left-hand side of your slide, towards the bottom, you can see that the project has got the inputs are, which we mentioned earlier, are power, water, and heat. And your installation 1, if you remember in the previous slide, we had a group of different installations, but in this case, we have one installation. We're making green hydrogen, and it's an electrolyzer, and the product is hydrogen. So hopefully that's pretty clear. That's what our project is doing. The reference, as we mentioned earlier, is the ETS benchmark for hydrogen. So again, you just have one installation. You have one product, which is hydrogen. So the inputs, now we're at the bottom right of the slide, we're looking at the change. So the inputs, all the inputs are new. So the processes have changed completely. But there is no change in the product, so the delta products is equal to 0. So basically we're looking at, we have a new process and we have new inputs, and that's really what's changed. The product at the end hasn't changed. Next slide, please. So as we said, emissions, so we're looking at processes and inputs now because they're the things that have changed. So very simply, as a very simple example, the reference for process 1 is the ETS benchmark for hydrogen, which is 8.85 tons of CO2 equivalent per ton of hydrogen. In our project, We've got power coming in, but as we said, we're assuming that in 2050 the emissions of the grid will be zero. So your greenhouse gas emissions associated with your power is zero. We have some water coming in, but under the rules of the Innovation Fund, emissions for water provision may be neglected. Input 3, heat. You have to assess the greenhouse gas intensity of the heat. And we have an ETS benchmark for heat, and it comes to 0.199 tons of CO2 equivalent per ton of hydrogen. So next slide, please. Now, we've done that. We've looked at the processes, we've looked at the inputs. So what is the overall change in emissions? So again, we're simply using the previous figures. So the delta emissions for the project are the emissions, the difference between the two figures that we just had, which comes to, if you look at the right of the screen, 0.865 tons of CO2 equivalent per ton of hydrogen. You can look at absolute and relative as well. So if the absolute would be the project emission savings by the throughput, so the amount of output from your system and the length of time it's running. The relative greenhouse gas savings are percentage. So you can see you've got quite a big greenhouse gas saving under the Innovation Fund rules there of 98%. Next slide, please. So now we've had a look at an example of how you would approach I say a very simple green hydrogen production, but now we're going to add a little bit of complication. We're going to say, well, what happens if you add a fuel synthesis step? So you're taking the hydrogen and you're going to make it into, you're going to synthesize it into another fuel. So it's still an energy intensive industry project. The sector changes though. So instead of, you remember Maria mentioned you had to pick your sector earlier on, and we've been looking at replacing hydrogen, but now we're talking about making an e-fuel. So we're looking at replacing something in the refinery sector. Also the product changes. You're now making e-fuels. And okay, that's not just one fuel. Other output products could include, so you could be looking at making some synthetic aviation kerosene, synthetic diesel, or synthetic gasoline. You would then choose one fuel as a principal product, generally that with the highest yield by expected revenue. But noted at the bottom, again in a little bit small writing, is that the product mix of your output will vary according to your synthesis technology and also upgrading. Next slide, please. So now we're looking at we're talking about making an e-fuel instead of just hydrogen. So how do we set the reference? Well, production falls under renewable fuels of non-biological origin. So now, instead of using an ETS benchmark as we did with hydrogen, we're looking at using a fossil fuel comparator, because that's what we're going to be replacing. So we have fossil fuel comparators for aviation kerosene, diesel and gasoline. And the aviation kerosene will be new to most of you, and that's provided in an updated version of Annex C, which I think went out this morning. So the key point here is that now, because you changed your sector, you're not replacing hydrogen, you're replacing an e-fuel. So you're creating an e-fuel, sorry, and you're replacing a fossil fuel. So that's what you need to compare your project against. So again, all reference emissions fall within the processes box of this schematic. So no inputs emissions in the reference scenario. If heat is exported by the fuel synthesis facility, you include the equivalent heat production, ETS heat benchmark. There are no change in emissions for products use or end of life, unless when you're making your e-fuel, you're claiming a higher hydrogen carbon ratio. You may want to try and claim lower combustion emissions. But keeping it simple, we're just, for now, we're comparing to the fossil fuel comparators. Next slide, please. So again, you're hopefully getting a bit more familiar with these steps. So you look at the processes and inputs for the project. So on the left of the screen, the processes, you have electrolysis, as in the first example. So again, you're making hydrogen, but in processes now below electrolysis, you'll see a new step, which is fuel synthesis and upgrading. So the inputs for the processes, for the electrolysis, it's the heat. We explained about power and water already. And the inputs for the fuel synthesis and upgrading, we're talking about hydrogen for upgrading, possibly, and catalysts. So there's a note at the bottom of the left of that slide which says upgrading to transport fuels must be included in order to use the fossil fuel comparators on comparable products. So in other words, you do have to include the upgrading step to the final fuel if you want to compare it to the emissions of the final fuels, which is what the fossil fuel comparators are. And thankfully, this example, the reference is quite simple. It's the fossil fuel comparators that we saw on the previous slide. Next slide, please. So the process boxes, we're looking again on the left of the slide at the project to begin with. So the synthesis and the upgrading could be treated as two processes. Going through the inputs, I'm at the bottom left of this slide now. So our inputs are power, maybe extra hydrogen, and the catalyst. So we're focusing now on installation 2 here in this example, because we know we've already looked at our hydrogen production. So we're focusing on this is the modification to that example. So installation 2 is your fuel synthesis and upgrading. We have it in one installation here, but they could be treated as two processes. So your products are kerosene, diesel, and gasoline, and possibly you'll have some heat coming out of that. Reference processes, or your reference, what you compare your project against are these fossil fuel comparators. And these are in the table, in the updated table 2.1 in Annex C. You know, they're pretty self-explanatory. The change that we're talking about, so now again we're comparing the reference to the project. So the inputs are all new, the processes have changed completely, but there's no change in the product. So we've assumed that we're making a like-for-like fuel when we're comparing it to the diesel or the gasoline. So it's essentially processes and inputs, but no change in the product. So next slide, please. So I think I better speed up a little bit. Variation 2, hydrogen is supplied for refueling fuel cell vehicles. So again, I just want to reiterate, we've used hydrogen as an example simply because it's a relatively simple starting point. So now instead of just making hydrogen or using the hydrogen to make an e-fuel, you're looking at refueling a fuel cell vehicle. So it's still an EII project. The sector changes, so you've gone from hydrogen to refineries, fuels. The product is still hydrogen, but it'll be supplied to replace the transport function, so the reference product changes. So you could look at synthetic gasoline or synthetic diesel. Next slide, please. So identify processes and inputs. So electrolysis, on the left you'll see in the project, so again we're making hydrogen, but now we've added another process, which is hydrogen distribution. On the right hand side you've got your fossil fuel comparator, because again we're putting this into a fuel cell vehicle now, and we're looking at it, comparing it to how life would be if you're just simply using a normal petrol or diesel car. Next slide, please. So because we're doing this, we have to consider the vehicle efficiency, and hydrogen fuel cell vehicles have a greater energy efficiency than conventional vehicles. So for example, in the JEC well-to-wheel version 4, so this is one of our top reference sources for literature. It's got an energy efficiency ratio of 2.8 is to about 2.8 is to 1 for fuel cell to spark ignition. Now, I should say at this point that this well-to-wheel study has been updated and is, if it is not already published, it's in the process of being published literally in the next couple of weeks. So essentially, the point here is that you multiply the fossil fuel production in the reference scenario by the correct energy efficiency ratio to give a like-for-like comparison. So that's the overall goal here, is that you know, to have a fair comparison, and that's what this is taking into account, the greater energy efficiency of the hydrogen fuel cell vehicles. Next slide, please. Okay, I can go through this relatively quickly. So now we're looking at another example, and this is for ethylene. And the point of this is really to look at, give a short example about end of life. So you consider a project to produce ethylene from biomass. So it falls within energy intensive industry. The sector is chemicals. Bioethylene is the principal product. And wheat ethanol is the assumed feedstock for the ethylene production. And for the example, we assume that ethanol production is within the project boundary, but wheat farming is not. Next slide, please. Again, you're looking at identifying the processes and inputs. So for the project, you can see towards the left of the slide, you've got ethanol under processes, you've got ethanol distilling, on-site heat generation, and catalytic dehydration. The inputs that we need to look at are wheat, yeast, and the catalyst. And the reference, we're making a chemical, so the ETS benchmark on the right-hand side of the slide is for high-value chemicals. Next slide, please. So the status of inputs, wheat, this is one point we wanted to make here, is that the emissions factor for biomass, biogas, biomethane, bioliquid, or biofuels from an indeterminate supplier are the default emissions, which are in Annex 5 and Annex 6 of the new Renewable Energy Directive, which came out in November 2018, but generally diminished by 15%. So our cultivation figure for wheat is 14.1 grams of CO2 equivalent per megajoule of ethanol. The reason we do that 15% cut in emissions is because under ETS rules, they don't look at the upstream emissions. They're looking at the combustion emissions, the direct emissions from the facility, but the upstream provision is not included. So that's why we've cut the emissions by 15%. So inputs to wheat production don't need to be individually assessed. So that's a bit of good news. Yeast and catalysts, these are likely to be the de minimis inputs. So we mentioned these briefly earlier. So very, very small greenhouse gas intensity associated with them. So they're likely to be able to be either ignored or just taken directly from literature. Water and power is before treated at zero. And we're assuming heat is generated on site. So it's assessed as part of a process box. Next slide, please. So change in products, change in use, and change in end of life. So if wheat ethanol production is brought within the system boundary, then some emissions should be attributed to the distiller's grains co-product, giving a credit within the delta E products. So in other words, because we're using bioethanol to make our product, our ethylene, in the production of the bioethanol, you're not only making bioethanol, you're also making a useful co-product. So there should be some emissions should be attributed to that co-product. So there would be a positive effect on delta E products. So bioethylene is chemically identical to fossil ethylene. So the delta E of use is expected to be zero. So the middle term here is expected to be zero. They're the same chemical substance. Then at the end of life, in the reference scenario, it can be assumed that the carbon in ethylene would be released as carbon dioxide. The landfilled waste is treated in the Innovation Fund greenhouse gas assessment as if it's incinerated. So biogenic CO2 emissions are rated as zero. So what happens here is at the end of life, there would be an emission credit for avoided end of life CO2 release. So next slide. Other points of note, possibly, well, we'd get to this. This is the most pertinent one. We've referred to it a little bit there because there's a huge amount of interest in creating innovative processes of creating fuels. And our original table 2.1 We just dealt with the main ones, but as you can see here, we've added in aviation kerosene, aviation gasoline, and marine fuel oil. So now you're going to have a much broader table that you can work with. Maybe we can. I think there's 2 more slides. I'm not sure they're critical, but we can have a quick look at them, please. So just a point, when we're talking about grid electricity, so again, we were looking at EII here. So grid electricity substituted by net electricity export or just discharging for energy storage. In that case, you'd use the expected 2030 electricity mix. If you're looking at electricity being consumed, you use the expected 2050 electricity mix. These are just the rules of the Innovation Fund. And that's simply because we wanted to point out the difference between the use and if you're under production. And the last, I think it's the last slide. Related questions. Well, possibly now I realize I've run over time. So this is, maybe I'll go through this one question, and then Maria, you might want to, or Roxana, you might want to take some Slido questions. I'm not sure, Maria, how would you like to proceed? Because we've gone through the main examples we needed.
So, yes, Adrian, thank you very much for your very, very clear and useful presentation. From now on, we will display the Slido. And Melina will ask some questions which we have selected from the number of questions which we are receiving. So hopefully we can answer them on the spot. A reminder to the applicants is that all questions which you really you still don't receive a proper answer, please put them in the help desk, and there we can provide detailed answers, because some of the questions are not so obvious and to answer so quickly in any case. So, Melina, up to you.
Yes, thank you and good morning. Thank you very much for the active participation on Slido. Indeed, we are receiving many interesting questions. I will ask the ones which are relevant for the widest possible audience and can clarify as much as possible. And indeed, as Maria said, questions which are more specific to your project or your idea and need more detailed answers could be better asked via the help desk. You find all links on the funding and tenders portal, all help desk, be it for IT issues, be it for substantial issues. Also, the frequently asked questions are there, and we invite you to consult them. So let's start with a question which has attracted a lot of attention. We said that, but maybe we clarify again. What is the format that you're expecting for the greenhouse gas savings calculation? One report in PDF format containing all information, for example, including the block flow diagram, or an Excel sheet template as for the CCS, or something else?
So what we're expecting is an Excel sheet where you present your calculation. Your question is very relevant indeed, because you will need to explain the calculation, but in an Excel sheet you can add tabs and provide all the information you have on assumptions, various assumptions taken, data, the block flow diagram, etc. In the application form, please be aware of the page limit. Therefore, there you just need to summarize the calculation for absolute and relative emission avoidance. So all the details have to come through the Excel sheet. But of course, be mindful that evaluators have relatively short time, so be as clear as possible and as concise as possible.
Okay, thank you. A question which we are getting a lot concerns the where can I find the greenhouse gas emissions of benchmark product activities? Is there a list that associates that? Also, there is another question down which refers to if benchmarks have to be applied for greenhouse gas calculation, the choice of benchmark should be made according to the product, the production of which is described by the benchmark, and not the technical calculation. Is that correct? Maybe we can clarify a little bit once more the ETS benchmarks, where are they found and how they should be applied.
Adrian, could you please take this one?
I can try, yeah. Well, basically the ETS benchmark should have the greenhouse gas intensity figure that you're associated with them. There are various decisions that are made and published. So you'll need to do a little bit of web searching for that. If you find that you've got your process is not fully covered by a benchmark, I mean, you can provide us with a justification. You could also use the existing process as the benchmark, provided that you're not. You need to provide a justification basically if you're not using an ETS benchmark. But I mean, we're that's perfectly acceptable as well once it follows the logic of the methodology. I'm not totally familiar with all of the benchmarking greenhouse gas intensities, but possibly, Maria, we could add a little bit on that. I don't know if we need to in the annex or something like that, but if it's becoming the top question, then possibly our guidance can be a bit clearer on that.
Well, immediately we can deal with this through publishing a frequently asked question and providing the reference. So this is what we can look into doing to be more clear.
That sounds perfect, I think. Is that okay?
Yeah, that is okay.
Okay. Moving a little bit to another topic. So Annex C, page 5 states that emissions due to the manufacturing process in the case of manufacturing plants are excluded. Can you explain in more details what is this referring to, and does it apply to the process industry or not? There have been also several questions regarding the difference between manufacturing and process emissions.
Adrian, is this clear enough question? Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, it's grand. I mean, basically what the person or people are asking about we're talking about here that we don't want you to include the emissions associated with building your new factory. And that's basically it. That's essentially the heart of it. I don't know if I need to go into more detail than that, but so for your project, let's say you have a new way of creating ethanol or methanol, and we don't require the calculation of the emissions associated with the construction of your new factory.
Yeah, I believe indeed this was the question, and there is a list of emissions that are generally excluded in the annex. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks. Another topic which is recurring is the following. There are in-between situations in which only one or several installations of all the installations of a plant is or are modified, and this predominantly is because the processes are modified. These instances should qualify as modification of an existing plant. Can you confirm this? There were also questions of what is a modification of an existing plant.
Well, this indeed sounds as a modification of an existing plant, and I just would like to remind that at the end of Annex C we have definitions, and we do have actually a definition of what is a modification and a retrofit or modification, so please look at it. And I don't know, Adrian, if you want to add on that.
Not really. I mean, I have to admit, I was still taking in the question when it flicked off the screen. We're moving quite quickly. But I think you're correct, Maria. And if, I mean, it helps to bear in mind we're trying to be as reasonable as possible as this. So that definition, a large part of that will be down to the applicant. And so if you followed a reasonable logic, you and followed the methodology, you're probably going to be right. But there is a bit of leeway in that, and information from the project applicant will be decisive in how that's formed into either of the categories. And possibly I should say as well, if I know Maria mentioned it earlier, but if we haven't answered a question completely clearly, there's a lot of them coming in. Please send them to the help desk, and we will get to them. So, thank you very much. I think we can continue.
Thank you. One last question, so we managed to stay within our time budget for this session. There have been several questions which refer to the link between projects, outputs, and products. So the question is, can a project have multiple outputs or products without a principal product? Or should there be one attributed between co-products, as in page 18? For example, project with 2 products versus reference product 1 plus reference product 2, or project is the attributed emissions of the principal product versus the reference of the product 1. I hope this is clear. There is also another question with a more concrete example on the definition of substitute product. Is green ammonia considered a substitute for gray ammonia? There are also questions on intermediate products in a company's production process. So if we can, with an intervention, clarify a bit this.
Yeah, I mean, again, there would be a fair bit of scope. I think it depends on the individual. It depends on the process and the project being put forward by the applicant. So, if you're talking about having a couple of products, we've discussed earlier that you would, for example, the ethanol production had a co-product which came into the system which wasn't in existence in the reference scenario. So in that case, you would have an emissions credit. You'd put some of the emissions onto the co-product from the ethanol production. So I think it depends on what the system is that the project applicant is proposing. So I would just say go with the most sensible. I'm still taking in the question. So you've got a product, a principal product, and you've got multiple outputs.
Well, I believe here, Adrian, the question is whether they can have more than one principal product, because they don't want to, in fact, determine a principal product, but they do need to determine a principal product because they need to select the sector and also for the calculation of the relative emission avoidance. They will need a principal product. Sure, yeah. So I believe there is a need to choose one of the products as a principal one. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's very well put, Maria. Thank you. And yeah, you can look at putting some of the emissions from the process on some of the other outputs. But as Maria said, you need to have a principal product in order to pick your which sector you're in. So much more clearly put than me, Maria. Thanks.
Yeah, of course, it depends on the exact project. So, if this is not entirely clear to the applicants, they can provide further details in the help desk. And then there was a question on the substitute product for whether green ammonia is substitute product for gray ammonia. It can be assumed like that, but in principle, substitute products will have different properties but have the same function. So, for example, if ammonia is used as a fertilizer, if an applicant can come with a more carbon efficient fertilizer which is not ammonia, and that will be a substitute product. And
exactly, yeah.
Yeah, so I believe we are running out of time for this session, and we want to really try and keep with the time. So we will move to the next presentation, which will be on CCS, renewables, and energy storage. And Laura Pereira will start with it as soon as we switch the screens.